So I'm now in a corner of the Royal Society of Arts where I've got a fellowship. So apologies for that. Yeah, but you've got a darkened image. Okay, so I'm not going to use any slides today. The idea is to talk about some general principles. And the specific focus here is on the European Union field guide on how to manage complexity in the crisis. Throughout this, I will be monitoring the chat. So if there's questions, throw them in. If I can deal with them, I will. The story of the field guide is actually quite interesting. We were working, and this is before the appalling actions of Brexit, but I really don't want to go back there. We were working with the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission on how to understand complexity in government, and they'd adopted my Cynefin framework for that. And we were in the middle of a whole series of actions to build workshops and support material. And then COVID hit, so we rapidly repurposed to say, you know, we got something now which is a real world problem. And it's quite important because it's the first ever government endorsement of an approach based on complexity theory, I think, at least without any compromise. So I'm quite proud and pleased with it. There's a link, you can download it for free, you can get copies in hard copy and so on, as it's a commission publication. Now, I'll go into some of the key actions that it talks about, and I'm going to flex them now to talk more about what would happen in large-scale projects. And just to give you a background on this, we're currently starting a series of programs in software development and also potentially large public transport infrastructure projects to look at different approaches to project management based on complexity theory. So what I want to do is to go through 4 or 5 key bits of science or key things that we know from natural science, which are going to inform the approach, and then start to talk about methods and approaches as we go through this, and I'll leave time at the end for questions. So a couple of things up front. First of all, the way we know things, I actually got a copy of the PBOK latest 7th edition a couple of days ago. And it's got some good stuff in it, but to be quite honest, its material on complexity and knowledge management would have been out of date in the 1990s. So I want to really build on those initially. So first thing is the way we learn lessons, or the way that we actually hold knowledge. And this is key because a large part of what we do on project management involves lessons learned, or also what we talk about as lessons learning. And I'll emphasize this, the need to learn micro lessons continuously throughout the project. One of the reasons for that is that the way people recall learning is very different from the way they know it at the time. So I ran a series of controlled experiments in IBM looking at major outsourcing bids. And outsourcing bids are multi-million-dollar projects. They run over anything from 6 months to 2 years. And the result is actually very binary. You either win it or you lose it. And there are $1 million at stake. So you're very quickly a hero or a villain. So what we did was to run a lessons learned process, which is a thing called Future Backwards. We have an open source wiki, so you can look up any method there, which focuses on multiple timelines, alternative histories, fiction. It's designed to get a large amount of diverse response set of people. So we ran that process before the teams knew whether they'd won the bid or not. And then we ran it afterwards within 24 hours of them knowing the bid result. And you would think you were talking about completely different environments. So if you look at the narrative when the outcome was contingent, they just didn't know, they're very circumspect, they're leaving options open, they're not being quite as assertive as they were afterwards. Afterwards, if they've won the bid, if they've been successful, they start to talk about this wonderful logical process in which they did all the right things and they made all the right decisions, as a result of which it was successful. Or if they failed, they're starting to readjust their history. They're talking about accidents, where they were unlucky, where they were inadequately resourced. And therefore, the sort of history, if you go backwards, when people know outcome, is kind of like deeply problematic from that. And it extends even beyond that. So I was doing work in the North Sea on knowledge capture from expert engineers on oil rigs. And I still remember flying out to a rig one day and in shall we say, fairly hazardous conditions, where you couldn't actually, the helicopter couldn't land. You had to jump off and hold on for dear life, which was not an enjoyable experience. And I sort of looked up from the floor at this Texan oil engineer who was kind of like one of their big troubleshooters. And I remember saying, well, how the hell are you going to find out what's wrong? Because, you know, we've got a helicopter, we've got waves crashing over the landing site. It's a force 3, force 4 storm. We got all the noise of a rig. It's a very noisy environment. You know, we've got headphones on. And he looked at me and he said, well, I already know, can't you hear it? And all I could hear was noise. But he could hear in what he called the music of the rig, and it's a lovely phrase. He kind of like knew automatically what to look for. And by asking him how he knew, in the context of his actually knowing, I pulled out half a dozen heuristics or rules of thumb, or ways that he was, as a deep expert, was making decisions very quickly under conditions of stress or uncertainty. Now, interestingly, when I interviewed him 2 or 3 hours later, we're now back in Aberdeen, it's in an office, it's a safe environment, and asked him how he made the decision, he gave me a structured, logical, ordered process, which actually didn't bear any relationship to the way he made the decision in the field. And this disconnect between how we know things at the moment and how we know things when we apply what's called retrospective coherence. And it's not just me, loads of people have actually discovered that. Now, as I go through these basic scientific facts, I'm going to start to point to some methods or tools which take them into account. So one of the things that means is that we need to capture lessons learned in the field as a project is running. We don't want weekly reports, monthly reports, or if you're into IT development, you know, a sort of weekly retrospective. It's not that those don't have value, but they're not as effective as continuous real-time capture. And the way we do that is with app-based Gemba tools, and taking that Japanese concept from lean manufacturing of the immediacy of the action and capturing lessons learned there as photographs or text or whatever, and allowing patterns to emerge into that as we go through the week. We also do that to create an increased level of horizontal peer-to-peer knowledge flow. So if you, for example, say, look, I've had a really good idea, I just need to catch it now. You can then say, are there any other ideas like this? And you get access horizontally to all the other projects, people who are engaged. Now, this original idea came from work with the US Army in Afghanistan, where we replaced patrol reports with continuous field capture from company commanders. And it was a voluntary act. We basically said, look, if you keep your field records up to date, you don't have to write a patrol report. We got 100% compliance because nobody wants to write a patrol report at the end of 12 hours, you know, hiking heavy weapons and packs in hostile circumstances. But what we then had was real-time data from multiple human observers that we could combine with more conventional scanning data to actually create an improved approach to the detection of IEDs, improvised explosive devices. And that sort of concept of human observations in real time is starting to come across into modern views about how we do project management. It's also important to understand how we store knowledge. One of the things which I got slightly irritated, I'm being British, this is British understatement, in the 7th edition of the PBOK guide, is it talked about knowledge as being tacit or explicit. Now, we knew that was wrong in 1995 when it was first got published. So why it's still in a handbook 20 years later, I don't know. The reality is knowledge comes in many different forms. One of the ways I look at it is a thing called the ASHA mnemonic, which stands for artifact, skills, heuristics, experience, and natural talent. So again, one of the ways that you actually map project knowledge is you get people to identify or record decisions as they make them. To record the information flows around those decisions as they make them, not retrospectively. And then you cluster those together and you ask that very question. When you make this decision, what artifacts, what skills, what heuristic, what experience, what natural talent, in order to create a map of knowledge, which is based on extreme levels of diversity. And what's interesting is most of the work around experience, which is part of the most valuable aspect of a knowledge base, is generally held in narrative form. And I remember doing works with Lend-Lease who are a major Australian civil engineering company, and I worked there on their projects in Darling Harbour, the San Francisco waterfront, and also the Blue Water Shopping Centre in Kent. And I think at the end of it, we estimated something like 70 to 80% of the effective knowledge flow was handled by engineers telling stories, and interestingly, stories of near disaster, not stories of success. And that matters in something else we know, that and if you look at fairy stories around the world, you'll find that the stories we tell our children are not stories of success, they're stories of failure. And the human brain pays more attention faster to failure than it does to success, because avoidance of failure is actually a more successful strategy than imitation of success. So you can start to see what I'm building here is if we can capture those stories and capture them in oral form as well as written form, if we can then, and this is called narrative enhanced doctrine in military terms, if we can then link those narratives into written text, we're creating a much more sophisticated knowledge asset and a much more sophisticated way in which people can find material, not just by going upwards and downwards, but by going horizontally and capturing experiences of people like them. And also, while I'm on that subject, we've also found it's far more successful if you want to capture learning, to actually get people to go through alternative timelines. So if they were on a successful project, get them to tell the stories of how they could have failed. If they're on an unsuccessful project, get them to tell the stories how they could have succeeded. Because if you shift people into a fictional environment, they give you much richer material. So that's kind of like principle item number one I wanted to talk about, the way we learn, the way we store knowledge. And I've talked both about the theory of that, but I've also talked about some of the practices. But this concept of immediate real-time in the moment feed to gather information is going to be a theme as I go through that. The second theme I want to pick up, and this is one of the three principal practices identified within the U Field Guide, is the value of informal networks in organizations. Now, this goes back to my original work in IBM when I did an extended project and looked at the balance between formal and informal knowledge flow and formal and informal communities across the whole of IBM Global Services. So this is worldwide, 180,000 staff. Okay. And what we actually found is the ratio between formal and informal communities was 1 to 60. And those were only the ones using technology for collaboration. So the ratio is probably much higher than that, but we didn't have a way of measuring it. And one of the things about informal communities or informal networks is they naturally carry trust with them, whereas trust isn't naturally present within a formal system. So by looking at informal communities and informal networks, we can get much faster, much more trusted flow of knowledge in the context of need. And I've done over about 100 interviews since COVID of CEOs in organizations, of governments and the like. And almost universal when I asked them the question is that under conditions of stress, they fell back to their informal networks, not the formal system. And there are all sorts of reasons for this. It's not just the trust concept, although that's absolutely critical. It's also the fact that informal networks evolve in a context separate from work itself. So they might come because we joined the company together, we worked on a project together, we served in the army together. That's common in Singapore, I'll come back to that. We support the same football team. Human beings have ways in which they create trusted relationships and casual conversations with people. And those are really strong. And it's one of the ways, by the way, that we look for organizational culture is to look at the health of those informal networks. If you don't have informal networks on a high degree of density, then the organization is actually quite unhealthy. It's rather like, if you don't know the example, fungal strands connect tree roots in healthy soil. If you don't have the fungal strands, the soil is unhealthy, the trees don't grow as well. So the informal network is rather like those strands. It's necessary to make the formal systems work. But the other reason is, so if you hit a crisis, then the reason you fall back to informal connectivity is that those connections, those ways of working, those communities can reform very quickly for something novel. Whereas the formal side of the organization was constructed around the previous needs, what we knew we needed to do in the past. And it takes a lot of time for it to adjust in the present. Now, the danger with informal networks is that they become perverse. So I'll give you two government examples. In Singapore, as I just mentioned, everybody in the Singapore government has done national service. They've served in the army or the air force or the navy. They built extensive networks in the officers' mess, the sergeant's mess, through going on exercises together. And for several years after they leave the armed services, they continue to go back for annual exercises. So they have a really strong, I could almost say democratic network of social links and contacts across the silos of the organization, which are extremely successful at building connection. In my own country, the UK, it works differently from that. So if you look into government, the principal connectivity comes from people who went to 2 or 3 elite private schools and then 2 or 3 elite universities. So it's not democratic in any way, it's actually quite perverted. So it's not that you will not have informal networks. The issue is, do you stimulate their formation or do you just let them happen accidentally? And there's a method within the EU Field Guide called entangled trios, which is designed to do just that. So I'll describe the principles of that. And again, this is a method set out within the open source wiki, so you can go and use it. And then I'll give you 2 or 3 examples of its actual use, one in software development, the other in government, which will split into a government and an industry example of the same process. In fact, probably I'll give you the examples first, because I think that will make it clearer. So one of the things we're now currently doing in terms of project design in the software business, and my background is software engineering, building decision support systems for companies like Guinness PLC worldwide. So I've always been at that sort of, how do we use computers and information to better support human decision making? And that's my background, both as a programmer, then as a manager, then as a general manager, then as a strategist. So one of the things which often goes wrong with software programs is the definition phase is where everything goes wrong. And there's a sort of old adage in software that users don't know what they want until you give them what they asked for. And then they realize they should have asked for something different instead. So the pace of change of what technology can do for people is going much faster than people's ability to know what to ask for. So we need to introduce far more diversity into that initial stage. So this is where we use an entangled trios concept. So what we take is a young, bright coder, somebody straight out of college, who's a whiz with their fingers and the keyboard, can build prototypes almost instantly, up to date on the latest technology, can build demonstrators, just knows what's possible. And we put them in a pair with a senior person, somebody who's a systems architect, and then system tester, somebody with at least a couple of decades of experience, who can see the bigger picture. And then the third member of the trio is a user trained to talk to IT people. And by the way, it's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than to train IT people to talk to users. We're going to put that program, that training program up as a public course shortly, because we get a lot of demand for it. If you want to know why, I'll go into the cognitive neuroscience of different skill bases. Right? So fundamentally, we've got a trio comprising user, inexperienced, experience. We throw 15 trios at the problem and allow them to build prototypes and build specifications rather than sending out a systems analyst to discuss what goes on. And then at the end of 2 or 3 months or 2 or 3 weeks of part-time activity, we look at what they've produced, we synthesize, and from that, we then produce the backlog, which goes into a technique like Scrum, or in a wider project, we're going to the overall project definition. So we're introducing far more variety at the front end to see what we should do in a project. Yeah. Another example in terms of architecture, and this we did in Denmark in Aarhus, where we, over 2 or 3 months, used children as ethnographers to capture stories from people in a community. And we use that as a scientific base to actually inform the overall architectural design by linking the way that people had interpreted their stories of how they wanted to live with architectural ideas similarly interpreted by architectural students So we created this suggestion of novelty, which feeds into the system. In standard work within companies now, we put people who just joined the company in their first 3 months. We get them to keep Gamba-style diaries, but then we put them into a pair with somebody close to retirement and then a trio with somebody in middle management, so that the young person with the older person, if they come up with ideas, somebody in middle management can make them work. And there's some sound neuroscience behind that as well. It's called the Grandparent Syndrome, or at least that's the name I gave it, in that grandparents will tell things to grandchildren they won't tell to their children, and so on. So you do that very young with very old, link it with somebody with power and authority, you can generate lots of ideas. And the way entangled trios methods work is you identify the roles which exist in an organization. You put pairs together where people can see logic, you give them a meaningful task, requirements definition. We're now doing a lot of the ones we're doing at the moment are lessons learned during COVID. And then this is a conditional trio method. If they come up with something which needs action, then they're put in touch with somebody with the authority to do it. But the key point is we've got lots of these groups working in parallel because we're trying to effectively map the space to get better knowledge of what's possible. And if you flex the trios every 2 to 3 weeks or every 2 to 3 months, depending on how fast you want to achieve it, literally within a year to a year and a half, everybody is within 3 degrees of separation of everybody else, having been part of a trio, which means you built this healthy connectivity, which is far more effective than trying to break down silos, which you can't do anyway. Silos allow people to have conversations at the right level of abstraction, so they're always going to be there. You really don't want to get rid of them, but you want to network people across. Final example of this, I'm giving you lots of examples to help the method across. We're doing work with UCSD at the moment, that's in the west coast of the United States. This was held up by COVID, but it's about to start, by which when you join university, let's suppose you join as an engineering student, you're put in a trio with somebody from the humanities and somebody from the pure sciences, and you have tasks to do every term, which are meaningful to the groups and helpful to the university. And it actually means the universities start to use their students as a sensor network to get feedback, early indication of sexual abuse and all sorts of things like that. But what you're also doing is you're building those channels between disciplines so that you can get a transdisciplinary flow of knowledge, and you can also find a whole new way of approaching task forces. So that's kind of like the second thing I wanted to talk about, is the need to build informal networks within and without the organization, because informal networks handle context-free information flow, so they're much better at handling a crisis or conditions of extreme uncertainty. So that's number 2. The third thing which is critical is, this comes back to the sort of knowledge concept, is you need to map what you know at the right level of granularity, so that you can, in the EU field guide, this is called acceptation or radical repurposing. So let me explain my terms here. If you look at what happens in evolutionary history, and you take, I'll give you 2 examples. So we now know that all dinosaurs had feathers, and the feathers were quite colorful, which indicates they evolved as much for sexual display as for warmth. And then there was one fairly small, fast-running dinosaur, which was heavily predated, which developed skin flaps under its forearms. We think the better to display its colorful feathers to attract a mate. But of course, when it runs, it puts out its forelimbs, it's got the skin flaps, so it starts to glide, and that's how we get flight. So we don't get a linear adaptation, we get a non-linear acceptation. So a trait which evolves under one set of circumstances and the different circumstances accepts for something completely different, particularly stress. The cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved in the higher apes to do fine-grained manipulations of muscles in fingers. It then accepts in humans to manage grammar in human language. So the huge sophistication of grammar control in all human languages, it's too hard for that to happen in a linear way. It requires a non-linear repurposing. Now, if you can't see the sense of this, then I'll give you some more modern examples. In 1945, a Raytheon engineer maintaining the magnetron of a radar machine, noticed that a chocolate bar had melted in his pocket. Now, he wasn't the first person to notice this, but he was the first person to realize the significance. So he experimentally put a metal box around the magnetron, and we got the first microwave oven. So the magnetron, which was developed and engineered for one purpose, was repurposed for something else. In a similar time frame, IBM were the worldwide market leaders in punch card control of industrial machines. They repurposed that to give them first mover advantage in the early days of computing, and they dominated through to the 80s and 90s as a result. Pfizer, two scientists at a conference in Canada, one reported a slightly embarrassing effect of a cardiac drug, and that became their best-selling drug, Viagra, until recently with COVID vaccines. The cure for leprosy came from somebody noticing the side effects of thalidomide, which was otherwise quite disastrous, but produced that wonderful effect. So human evolution is mainly repurposing things we already know for something radical. And this is actually a key capability in a project, because projects are going to go wrong. You need to find ways to sort of, there's a British phrase, make, do, and mend. You can't always produce the perfect solution, but if you can repurpose something very quickly, you can get strategic advantage. So coming back to that Gemba concept of people recording all the decisions in information flow, and looking at those Ashen elements, artifact, skills, heuristic experience, and natural talent. What we then do is we create knowledge databases which hold the data at that level of granularity. They don't put it into taxonomies or put too much structure, because we want to find ways to radically recombine it very quickly. Now, again, I'll give you an example of a real case on that. We were working with one of the world's biggest lighting companies, and they had the idea that if you bought lights as a garden feature, they could create a new market. At that time, people just bought lights to light gardens. They didn't see them as a garden feature. So we got about 3,000 micro narratives in from across Europe. This was done with a Twitter campaign. When we do this work, people interpret their own story, but they interpret it into non-gameable index structures. So we didn't ask about things like light, but we hid aspects of light and shade in the way that people signified meaning in their story. We used geometric shapes for this. And then we got everybody in the lighting company to actually take a photograph or create a web-based reference to a specification for an engineering component and interpret what they thought that engineering component was about into a very similar signification structure. And then we mashed the two databases together and came up with 5 clusters. And 3 of those clusters became significant businesses, because marketing people were saying, well, why has that been linked with that? Oh, hang on a minute, I know what we can do. And to give you the most obscure example which came out of it, there's now a plastic rock that changes color according to human proximity in swimming pools. It's very popular in Southeast Asia. And the core technology is a lighting circuit developed to handle urine-saturated staircases in a football stadium. And nobody would have made that connection before. So not just in a crisis, but on a day-to-day basis, you need to store project knowledge and artifact knowledge and process knowledge at a fine enough grain level that it can be repurposed very quickly or recombined with something different. And again, that's a basic capability that needs to be built into organizations. And then the 4th thing I want to talk about, and again, this is in the core capabilities outlined within the field guide, is the concept of human sensor networks. Now, one of the reasons for this is a thing called inattentional blindness. So in a series of experiments, and I'll give you one of them, they all come up with similar results. If I give radiologists who are highly trained individuals, a batch of x-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final x-ray, I put a picture of a gorilla in plain sight, which is 48 times the size of the average cancer nodule, then 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. As I say, this is called inattentional blindness. It's not something you can train people not to do. In practice, the most we scan of available data before we make a decision is about 5%, and that's on a good day if we're really focused. That triggers a series of memories, not only in our brain, but in our body and often in our social interactions. And we blend those fragmented memories together. It's called conceptual blending. And the first blended pattern which applies, we use. So we do a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match based on a limited data scan. And you can see why this happens in evolutionary terms. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and have an identified lion, look up best practice case studies on how to avoid being eaten by lions? By that time, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I found of a survivor's account of how they escaped from the digestive tract of a large carnivore. So we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan privileged our most recent experiences. And it means that we do not see what we do not expect to see. So one of the things we worked on, this was work on counterterrorism for DARPA in the United States before and after 9/11, is how do I very quickly gather data which will make different views or perspectives visible and will also identify outliers. So the way we do that, for example, and I'll give you a couple of cases, but I want to talk about attitudes as well. So if I'm facing a complex situation, let's take the outbreak of COVID, I might put an infographic together with press stories and internal documents and basically distribute that to the whole of my workforce. And ask them in real time to interpret what they think is going on and create a micro scenario about what they think will happen next. So if that gives me a very large network in most organizations, which is culturally diverse, gender diverse, age diverse, and so on. So I've got lots of people looking at it, but nobody is connected with anybody else. That's vital. Yeah? And because they all look at it and because they all interpret it into a quantitative framework, and again, this is the same sort of approach we developed elsewhere, you don't know what the right answer is. We can then draw contour maps, so like colored maps, which show the dominant view, the minority views, but critically show people who are seeing something which nobody else is seeing, which you can then focus on. Now, you should start to realize that if we got this sort of thing in place on a large project, it radically increases our chances of spotting anomalies early before they come through the full reporting cycle. And I'll talk a bit about that in a second. But that sort of ability to do that is key. We also do it on things like attitudes to safety, to cybersecurity, where we'll present an ambiguous situation to the employees, somewhere where there isn't an obvious right answer, get them to interpret that, and then look at the patterns of interpretation to actually tell us what attitudes are. So, example, one we did with a big manufacturer, when we did the final representation, we were looking at job completion on one scale against rule compliance on the other. And kind of like basically there were two incompatible states. You either got the job done or you followed the rules. There was nothing between the two. And so we could then, that sort of gave us a huge amount of insight. We could then start to shift. Now, of course, there were other patches of opinion in that landscape. And this is a key concept of change, which is what you do is you look at where you are. So attitudes to safety, attitudes to cybersecurity, attitudes to project compliance. And remember, attitudes are lead indicators, so intervention is a lot less costly. And so if I'm in one place and I want to move to another place, I don't just try and leap towards an idealized future. I identify a pattern of narrative, a pattern of observation, which is close to where I am, like a stepping stone. And I shift to that. And then I look again and shift again. And this is kind of like one of the key lessons about how do you change people's attitudes and beliefs, is you don't do it by preaching or by setting idealized standards. You do it by identifying sustainable next steps. I say adjacent possibles. If you want a lovely illustration of this, and there's an excuse for you all to go and watch a good Disney movie, then go and watch Frozen 2, which is a wonderful complexity movie. And in the middle of it, the real heroine of the movie, who's the younger sister, not the one with magic, does this wonderful song, and she says, all I can do is do the next right thing. And that's the principle of managing high levels of uncertainty, is do the next right thing. But in order to know what that is, you have to have a multiple human sensory system in place, so you can map where you are and where you can go. And there's a broad principle here, by the way, is that generally in this sort of work, you start journeys with a sense of direction rather than to try and achieve goals. Yeah, and that's the important one. So those are kind of like three elements of the field guide. So informal networks, human sensor networks, map knowledge at the right level of granularity for repurposing. And I've also talked about the context of how do you do knowledge and lessons learning. So that leads me on to the final thing I wanted to talk about, which is complexity. And this is where the Cynefin framework comes into its own, which has been around for about 22 years now in various guises. It's going through, just finished a later stage of evolution. And the way the Cynefin framework is identifies three fundamental types of system: ordered systems, complex systems, or chaotic systems. So I'm going to define my terms because these terms are used differently by different people. So an ordered system has a high level of constraint so that all behavior is predictable. A chaotic system has no effective constraint, so behavior is actually random, which means it won't last for long, but it can be quite scary. And a complex adaptive system is one where there are constraints, but they're called enabling constraints. So it's like everything is entangled or connected with everything else. You know, rather like undergrowth in the forest or a mango swamp, the roots of a mango forest. You know, so you kind of like know that they're separate and you know there's a structure, but you can't see it and you can't change it. So this concept of deep entanglement means that there isn't a normal linear relationship between cause and effect. The same thing will only happen again the same way twice by accident. A heuristic to know you're in a complex space, by the way, is very simple. If the evidence supports conflicting hypotheses about what you should do next, and you can't resolve which is right within the time frame for decision making, then you assume it's complex. And instead of doing one choice, you create safe to fail experiments around every coherent hypothesis and then see what happens. They're more probes than they are experiments. Now, if you want the metaphor for this, you can think about solid, liquid, and gas. So solid is order, liquid is complex, difficult to contain, fluid, gas, permeable is chaos, highly permeable. And as if you remember your high school physics, you'll know that there's a thing called latent heat. So as water reaches 100 degrees, it doesn't become steam until you put more heat in. And that's called latent heat, and it's a phase shift. It was snowing in Wales when I was walking last weekend, and the atmosphere warmed up a bit first because heat has to be thrown out for the liquid to become a solid. So the boundaries between order, complex, and chaos are phase shift boundaries which require energy to be put in or taken out. And of course, if you also know your basic high school physics, you'll know there's this thing called a triple point, which is a balance of pressure and temperature, where it's equiprobable whether something will become solid, liquid, or gas. And in the Cynefin framework, that's called the aporetic domain. Aporia as an English word means an unresolvable question. It means you've got a high level of ambiguity or confusion from which you could go in different directions. And then we further divide the order domain into clear and complicated. If it's clear, in the UK, we drive on the left, everybody should do that. If it's complex, that's expert knowledge, but the boundary there isn't a phase shift boundary. Now, the EU field guide is based on the Cynefin framework, and it's based on the principle that dependent on which domain you're in, order, complex, or chaos, you do different things. And it's also based on the principle that in a crisis, you shift into the aporetic domain in order to decide where you go. As a general point here, one of the key roles of leaders, by the way, the higher you get in an organization, the fewer decisions you make, the more you're responsible for coordinating other people making decisions. Unless there's a crisis where you have to act decisively very quickly to increase the number of options available downstream. You don't act to resolve the thing, you act to create options. Yeah? And anybody who's been a project manager will have been in that circumstance and kind of like know what I'm talking about. Yeah? So the Cynefin framework provides a method by which we don't take a single method or a single approach. We use different methods and different tools. And the vast majority of techniques that you see either in PBOK or you see in Prince 2 basically assume an ordered system. And so some of the work we're now starting to do is to say, well, what would things look like in project management if we recognize things were complex? And if we did that, it would mean we would be doing more small things in parallel before we firmed up. Yeah? And we'd also be creating these continuous micro observations throughout the project. So we would get this early weak signal detection, this identification of potential problems. And this is something which we call anticipatory alerts. And again, it comes from counterterrorism. You can't predict a terrorist outrage, but you can trigger human beings to a heightened state of alert when a terrorist outrage is more likely. So the purpose of the Cynefin framework is to identify when you do different things. So again, I'll sort of run through this in the case of software. Cynefin also has another line drawn on it, which creates liminal domains, which are boundary spaces between the main ones. So if I'm looking at software development, and remember I talked about the entangled trios of young developer, systems architect, user trained to talk to IT people, that's a new way of defining what the project should be. And that's truly complex because it's lots of things in parallel. You can then take something like Scrum, and Scrum is a brilliant collection of methods. It's not a framework, it's a collection of methods to make complex things which have become less complex into complicated or ordered approaches. So I take an approach like entangled trios, I allow that to explore the space, and then I feed that into the backlog on Scrum, then it moves into the complicated space. Another technique we developed here is called 888, and that's based on a JAD workshop, Joint Application Design, by which you spend 8 hours working with users in a workshop, building prototypes, talking through what they want. It's a lot easier than interviewing them. And then at the end of the day, you hand on the prototype, but not the user requirement, to a program. First time we did this was a programming team in Mumbai. So we started in Farnborough in the UK, handed it on to Mumbai. They had 8 hours to improve it without sight of the user need. And they handed it on to a team in San Jose who had another 8 hours, and then it came back. Now, every time I've run that process, users look at it and say variations on, I would never have thought of that, can I please have it? So again, I'm dealing with complexity by increasing mutation rates to increase variety. And so again, there's solid science there. And for those interested, we spent the last 2 or 3 years working on a complexity-based approach to design thinking. You can find details on the website. And one of the things which comes out of that is the need to do this continuous journaling approach to capture unarticulated user needs. Because if I can use existing technology to meet an unarticulated need, I may actually remove the need for whole difficult aspects of projects. So different techniques in that space. We're also, to be honest, reintroducing time boxes a lot as well. We see a lot of software. So the way a time box works is you guarantee delivery on a date, because in a multi-threaded project, dates matter, right? But what you do is a minimum viable delivery and a maximum achievable delivery, and a minimal level of resource and a maximum level of resource. And the team are then basically contract with the organization to guarantee a delivery on a certain date. And the least they will do is the minimal viable product for the maximum level of resource. And that's an extremely effective technique, which has been much neglected because we got obsessed with 2-week sprints when actually there's nothing wrong with a 3-month time box. For those interested in this, again, we're about to launch a big initiative which will decompose all the popular software methods down into their smallest viable component part and allow you to assemble methods and tools from different vendors to create a structured project, effectively using a best of breed approach. So as I say, we're putting that together at the moment, and we got people like Comic Agile working with us. Now, the reason I've gone through that is to give you this basic concept that something which works in a complex domain will not work in an ordered domain and vice versa. and you have to have this diversity of approach within the system. So I've gone through 5 things. I've gone through knowledge, I've gone through informal networks, I've gone through human sensor networks, I've gone through radical repurposing, and now I've basically explained Cynefin as an overall approach. And that's probably the point where I should open up to questions. Yeah? And I see there's 2 already. I'm not sure why Cynefin became that popular, to be honest. I think if I look at it with hindsight, it wasn't a framework which was produced as a once-off study and published. It actually evolved quite radically over the 20 years. So as I got more theory, I would change the framework I practice it. So the framework has evolved. It got picked up by the XP community, not the Scrum community, and that was probably important. But I think also we haven't policed it, and we made it open source. And it passes what I call the back of a table napkin test. If you can't draw a framework on the back of a table napkin from memory, it has no utility for sense making. So people have picked it up and used it without me being involved, and I'm quite pleased about that. So it's kind of like worked, all right? And long may it continue to do so. Yeah? I think I've talked about the informal networks by talking about, this is to Nicola's question, by talking about entangled trios. There are other techniques like social network stimulation, but the key thing is to stimulate their formation so that you can use them, but not to make them formal or explicit. Okay, so those are the questions I saw in the chat. Taras, over to you. Is there anything else?
Thank you. Thanks a lot for your for the keynote. It was really insightful. Yeah, indeed, I have a couple of questions to maybe go in one level deeper to the concept that you've explained. So indeed, Gamba is kind of a buzzword nowadays as well. At least it was before the COVID. So I'm curious to hear your opinion on maybe your experience already on how to apply Gamba properly with the remote and distributed teams, because the whole IT sector at least went to this mode, and I don't feel that we will ever get back to the real customers in the fields.
And you can't draw a chalk circle on the floor and make somebody stand in it anymore. The way we're doing it is an app and a web-based tool. This is SenseMaker Gamba, right? So declare a commercial interest in this. This is one of our products. And that allows people to capture a website, a photograph, text, or voice in any combination. And the key thing we developed and patented is this concept of high abstraction metadata to interpret it. So it's non-gameable, yeah? So that means people, and it's almost like gamification, people place their capture item into, say, 6 triangles which balance all positives. Yeah, I'll give you a better illustration of that, actually. One of the things we're using Gamba for at the moment is team feedback. Right, so what you do is every time you interact with a member of the team, you describe the interaction. You don't evaluate the interaction. And then you might have a triangle which says, in this interaction, the team member was altruistic, assertive, analytical. So 3 positive qualities. Yeah. And then the team member can look at their pattern and then say, well, I'm all analytical, assertive, I'm not altruistic. But at no point is any judgment made. So Gamba is based on this very fast capture and abstract interpretation. Now, for me, that's critical on knowledge capture, lessons learned. We can actually create a retrospective from the Gamba input. Yeah, but I think it's real-time, immediate, collaborative, and we also use that on the trios.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Another question about formal and informal networks in the organization. It's also quite clear that informal networks are basically the drivers of the culture.
Yep.
And they're more powerful in general than the formal ones, and that's why people rely on the informal ones when something bad happens, right? And meanwhile, the whole management machine that it exists at the moment in the organization, it's about building formal systems for many reasons, like in trust, etc., etc. But the point is, how can the manager who knows who is aware of the fact that yes, I can build whatever I want in terms of the governance, but there will be a lot of informal stuff going on too. How can the manager compile these 2 ways of working, that I mean formal and informal system, into something meaningful for his or her project or work field.
I mean, interestingly, this wasn't really a problem until the 1990s. And it's quite interesting. A lot of people demonize Taylorism in scientific management, but actually that's unfair. When you hear what they talk about, they're actually talking about systems thinking from the 90s onwards with things like business process reengineering. Taylor actually was trying to humanize the workforce. And the assumption was managers would serve apprenticeships. They would build informal networks by working in the same organization over a period of time. So nobody would have questioned informal networks. But from the 90s onwards, as the engineering metaphors of systems thinking come in, the assumption is it's got no value unless it's formal. And I sometimes think that organizational change consultants have created a Stockholm syndrome relationship with their CEO. I mean, the guy is being captured by terrorists and doesn't realize it, right? Because senior executives all know that they use their informal networks and they have lots of things to create them. They play golf together, they go to clubs, they go on courses, right? So it's not that we don't do this stuff. We try and pretend it's not happening. What we're doing with things like entangled trios and social network simulation is deliberately created so it's democratic and recognizes its value. And I think that's key.
Oh, yeah, that's actually about my next question, because maybe I got the wrong feeling that when you were explaining the way of building these trios, and first time I've met this approach in the tribal leadership book, if I'm not mistaken, about building triads, as it calls there. So doesn't it make it formal if you actually, as a manager, force people like, guys, and from now on, 3 of you work together?
Well, we put voluntary elements in it. So let's take an example we're doing on health learning, right? So you can identify roles which exist in the community, like, community police officer, district nurse, A&E nurse, whatever. Yeah. And then you basically say to people, it's your choice who you work with. But if you're a district nurse, you've got to form a pair with a teacher for the next month. Yeah. So here's a list of teachers, decide who you want to work with. And between you decide which of the other roles you want in your trio. So we make that entirely voluntary. Yeah. And it can be declared, but it doesn't have to be declared if you want to keep it secret, right? And then they work together. So we give them capture lessons during COVID, interview people, we keep it active, we make people curious. And then after a couple of weeks, we break that up and we create another set of pairs, they choose another third. And that's what creates a network. Yeah. And it creates it by allowing the thing to grow organically over time. Yeah. A technique like social network stimulation, which is similar, is you declare a series of intractable goals that you need, intractable problems that you've got as a company. You create an empirical measure of success, which ideally should be externally measured. And then you create rules for team formation, which force people to work with people they haven't worked with before. And you create awards if the team succeeds. So you basically say, look, there's a program guide. These are our problems. These are the rewards. If you can form a team based on these heuristics, and we use dating agency software for that, so that people can link, you get the reward. I mean, the first one I ever did, the target was $20 million of added value benefit to the client. And the reward was 3 months sabbatical for every member of the team. So we got mass participation. We got a huge benefit for the client. It cost us a lot less than a conventional consultancy program. It was brilliant. But if you run SNS every 6 months, within 18 months, everybody's within 3 degrees of separation. Yeah. So I think a lot of complexity work is giving people things they do which they find meaningful, which indirectly achieve what you want to achieve as an organization, rather than trying to always directly do it. So it's like, I would never create corporate value statements or corporate purpose statements because I know they're a complete waste of time. But I would create barrier stories of things we don't want to be. Because if we agree on what we don't want to be, that creates a counterfactual space. And then people can explore open options within that space, and that's more fluid. And again, that appeals to what people like to do. We like to spread negative stories. We like more autonomy over direction. None of us want to be told we've got to be an X, Y, Z type of person.
Yeah, that's true. Meanwhile, I was always wondering how this all approaches of building teams, tribes, you name it, trios and the triads. Yeah, I mean, how are they dealing with the fact that a lot of people are not either are not trained, or they just don't want to, don't express any wish to work in the teams, rather lone wolves.
You don't need to have everybody participate to network an organization, actually. You only need to have about 10 or 15% actively at each stage. And then it's the button threading problem. So as the things start to connect, you get exponential linkages. Yeah. So you don't have to have a universal on that. And I would always make them voluntary, right? But I think the other problem is, I mean, I blame Spotify for this because they should never have published what they did. And they're really upset that they did because everybody's trying to copy it. They keep saying there isn't a Spotify model, right? Despite what McKinsey say.
Yeah.
They called things tribes, but they went through quite a long evolutionary cycle to get there. And there's one bank in Australia which has just renamed everything based on the Spotify names and not made any changes, right? You can start a similar journey to other people, but you can't arrive at their endpoint unless you go through a similar journey. Entangled trios is a method based on formal roles. Yeah, crews are more effective than teams because people are trained in role and role expectation, but you have more time on training before you get into action. And I think certainly in the Agile community, they need to stop talking about teams. And they need to start building, because teams have to go through forming, norming, all that sort of stuff. They're heavily dependent on individual characters. So then they get into nonsense like talking about mindsets. There's no such thing as a mindset, let alone a mental model, for God's sake. I mean, those were cute ideas in the 80s, but science has moved on along some way since then. Yeah, well, we don't put enough in training people into role and role interaction. And if you're trained in, and this is how the emergency services work and the military services work, and it means you can put people together without it being dependent on their personality. And that's better for people as well because it reduces stress.
Yeah, I see. That makes sense. Also, the interesting question, also after your explanation about the Cynefin framework, that it makes sense when it can be put back on the napkin, right? And meanwhile, you emphasized a lot about the informal knowledge and like these micro narratives, right? And building more like the narrative base, knowledge base instead of like the factual reports knowledge base. How from your experience, like, I mean, in my experience, even when it's very factual and very like table based and very, like very dry out information to make it less scary for people to go through, and even then it's sometimes really hard to somehow embrace the mood to like read the reports or going through the learning lessons.
Nobody will.
Etc. Yeah. So when you have a base of micro narratives, which is like hard to maintain, possibly, maybe I'm wrong here, right? So hard to maintain, how to navigate through, etc. How do you encourage people using it?
You're badly wrong. It's a downside cheaper. It's about 1% of the cost of a formal KM system, because people self-interpret their own narratives on entry. So you don't need to do anything else but put them in a database and allow people to search. So for example, I might index my experience as a military officer, on 6 triangles. And then I could say, well, if I knew the answer to this problem, I'd index it in this area of that triangle and this area of that triangle. And then you find everything else that everybody's indexed that way. So it's a deliberately abstract search. So it allows for serendipity, for accidental discovery. So narrative databases are extremely effective. I mean, to give you a further illustration, so there's Polanyi famously said, we always know more than we can say. I extended that to say we always know more than we can say. We can always say more than we can write down. And the reason people get bored with written documents is they know they're 10% of what the person was trying to communicate. I mean, if you really want to do, I mean, it takes years to write a book. It takes 10 minutes to explain something to somebody because you can use a different sort of base. So, for example, I'll give you 2 cases. What we did with the US military is narrative enhanced doctrine. So basically, people tell stories and the stories are linked with the formal written document. So if you read the written document, you can then click and read the stories, which give you context. Or if you find the stories in an ambiguous search, you discover some are linked to the document, you're more likely to link to the document. And the document can now be about a 10th the size of what it is. Yeah. So you reduce your costs. The other way is, I mean, for my many sins, I've written 2 ISO 9001 manuals in my life. And I remember this is the quality standard, all right? So I got summoned by the CEO and he said, you're going to write the ISO 9001 manual. And I said, why me? I'm the one who breaks the rules, all right? I mean, last time I was in this office, you were screaming at me. And he said, famous phrase in Britain, poachers make the best gamekeepers. He said, you'll write something other people like you will follow. If I give it to quality control, it will be a 50-volume manual and nobody will ever pass. So I was still a programming then. So I just used a do case sequence for everything which we need to do on quality. I just did a series of do case statements, if this, then this, if this, then this. And when I couldn't think of anything else where it was an obvious the answer, I said, for anything else, assemble these 3 people and they record their decision and it's implemented. And I ensured there was diversity in the trio. Yeah, it's before I knew about complexity. So that was actually saying all of these things are ordered, everything else. We create a process to make a decision uniquely in context. We then actually, I mean, I probably shouldn't say this, but we had another book, which was a list of people who couldn't be trusted to answer questions from quality control inspectors. And we were a secure site, so we could hold them up on their ID while we evacuated managers from the building so their nominated deputies could answer the questions, right? But again, I think and the big problem with engineers is that although they're very narrative based, they like things which are written. And writing things down takes a lot of time. People don't do it. If you look at the PBOK guide, I mean, I'm frankly quite appalled, to be honest. It's so trivial in parts that you think this is a 7th edition. And they've got one paragraph on knowledge management with a 1980s concept in it. And knowledge management is key to project management. So the danger is we end up with this lowest common denominator, everything which is uncontroversial, which is committee based, and we don't create something of high utility to actually help people manage through projects.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, that might be the last comment on that. Taking into account that a lot of managers claim that they spend 80% and more of the time already communicating, don't you think it will, like the concept of this micro narrative knowledge base will put even more pressure on them, and they will say like, oh, I spend 100% talking, like I don't
it's okay
do
to be quiet. When I was strategy director, I used to just walk around the building with a clipboard. I spent 80% of my time just walking around, chatting with people. And we did more innovation as a result of that than me sitting writing documents. Because I became a familiar site, not a corporate hack. And I was curious about what they were doing. And I didn't mind making the odd coffee for people and stuff like that. The really good senior managers I've met actually spend very little time other than talking with people because their role is coordination. Yeah. And you can get people to record, what they've learned from people. We do that. Leadership 360 is like Team 360.
Yeah. Okay, I understand. Thank you. Thanks a lot for your time.
Pleasure.
Thanks a lot for your
it's a pleasure.
For the insightful speech. And
sorry, it ended up in a slightly darkened room in central London.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Tareth.
Yeah. Be in touch.
Enjoy the rest of your run. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.